The rooster's crow pierced the humid South Carolina air at 4:30 in the morning, but Kunto had been awake for hours. Sleep came fitfully in the cramped quarters he shared with 12 other enslaved men, their bodies pressed together on rough wooden platforms that served as beds. The single window, barely large enough for a child to crawl through, let in precious little air during the stifling summer nights of 1703. Kunto sat up slowly, his back aching from another day, bent over rice plants in the swamplands surrounding Magnolia Plantation. At 35, he had already spent half his life in bondage, stolen from his village in what the white men called Senegambia, when he was barely 17. The memories of his homeland, the sound of his mother's voice, the taste of palm wine, the rhythms of talking drums, had grown fainter with each passing year, but they never entirely disappeared. "Time to move, brothers," he whispered in Wolof to the men around him, using their native language as an act of quiet defiance. Master Grimball had forbidden any language except English in the quarters, threatening 20 lashes for anyone caught speaking what he called heathen tongues. Kwame, a man from the Gold Coast, stirred on the platform beside him. "Another day in paradise," he muttered bitterly in English, his voice heavy with irony that had become their shared defense against despair. The men rose in the darkness, their movements careful and practiced. Any unnecessary noise might wake the overseer, who slept in a small cabin just 50 yards away with a loaded musket always within reach. They dressed quickly in the rough homespun shirts and trousers that were replaced twice a year, garments so coarse they chafed the skin raw during the first weeks of wear. Outside, the quarter was already stirring to life. 43 enslaved people lived in the collection of rough-hewn log cabins that housed the workforce of Magnolia Plantation. The quarter was laid out in 2 rows facing each other, with a narrow dirt path running down the middle. At one end stood the overseer's cabin, positioned to observe all comings and goings. At the other end was the communal cookhouse, where meals were prepared in massive iron pots suspended over open fires. Asha emerged from the women's quarters, her infant daughter Zara strapped to her back with strips of cloth. The baby had been born just 3 months earlier, fathered by one of the field hands, though Asha had never revealed which one. In the brutal mathematics of slavery, relationships formed and dissolved based on the constant threat of sale and separation. Love was a luxury that carried the terrible risk of heartbreak. "Morning, sister," Kunto said softly as Asha passed, using the term of kinship that had evolved among the enslaved community. Blood relatives were rare in the quarters. Most had been separated from their families during the Middle Passage or subsequent sales, so bonds of chosen family provided the emotional support necessary for survival. Asha nodded wearily. She had been up throughout the night with Zara, who was teething and feverish. The plantation's master, William Grimball, allowed enslaved mothers 6 weeks after childbirth before returning to fieldwork, a concession motivated more by economic calculation than human compassion. A dead worker represented a financial loss. A temporarily reduced worker was merely an investment in future productivity. As the sky began to lighten, revealing the Spanish moss that draped from ancient live oak trees like funeral shrouds, the quarter came fully alive. Children emerged from the cabins, their ages ranging from toddlers to teenagers. The younger ones would spend the day under the supervision of elderly women too old for fieldwork, while those over 12 would join their parents in the rice fields. Cuffy, an elderly man who had survived 30 years of bondage, began his morning routine of checking on the small garden plots that enslaved families were allowed to maintain behind their cabins. These tiny patches of ground, perhaps 10 feet square, provided supplemental food that made the difference between survival and starvation. The weekly rations provided by the plantation, a peck of rice, a pound of salt pork, and whatever vegetables were available, were calculated to keep workers alive and functional, not comfortable. "Okra's coming along fine," Cuffy told Kunto as they examined the small plants. "Should have fresh pods in a few weeks." The okra had been smuggled from Africa in the hair of enslaved women, one of countless ways that African agricultural knowledge had transformed American farming. The irony was not lost on the enslaved community that their expertise made their masters wealthy while they themselves remained property. The sound of a bell rang across the quarter, signaling the official start of the workday. Overseer John Morgan emerged from his cabin, already dressed in riding clothes and carrying his ever-present whip. Morgan was a poor white man from the backcountry who had worked his way up to his current position through a combination of ruthlessness and complete loyalty to Grimball's interests. "Move along, you lazy devils!" Morgan shouted, his voice carrying the peculiar mixture of authority and insecurity that characterized men whose power derived entirely from their ability to brutalize others. "Master wants the East Field cleared today, and by God it'll be cleared." The enslaved workers formed into groups based on their assigned tasks. The rice fields required different skills and presented different challenges than tobacco or cotton cultivation. South Carolina's tidal rice system was based on African agricultural techniques that most of the enslaved workers understood better than their white overseers. This knowledge created a complex dynamic where the enslaved possessed expertise that was essential to plantation success while being treated as ignorant property. Kunto joined the crew assigned to flood control, managing the intricate system of dikes and floodgates that regulated water flow through the rice fields. This work required precise timing and deep understanding of tidal patterns, skills he had learned both from his African heritage and through years of careful observation. As the work crews departed for their various tasks, families said quick goodbyes that carried the weight of uncertainty. Any day could bring news of a sale, a punishment, or an accident that would permanently separate loved ones. Children kissed parents who might not return that evening. Spouses exchanged glances that communicated volumes about love persisting under impossible circumstances. While these daily struggles unfolded in countless slave quarters across colonial America, remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more untold stories of survival and resistance in early American history. The rice fields stretched endlessly under the brutal South Carolina sun, their geometric precision a testament to the fusion of African agricultural knowledge and American slave labor. Kunto waded knee-deep through the flooded fields, his bare feet sinking into mud that sucked at each step like quicksand. The water, stagnant and warm, bred mosquitoes and disease while reflecting the heat until the air above shimmered like a mirage. "Keep that water level steady," called Quash, the enslaved driver who supervised fieldwork under Morgan's direction. Quash occupied a precarious position between the enslaved community and white authority. His knowledge of rice cultivation made him indispensable, but his survival depended on balancing loyalty to his fellow enslaved people with enough compliance to avoid the overseer's wrath. The work was backbreaking and dangerous. Enslaved workers stood in water for 12 hours at a time, planting rice shoots by hand while battling snakes, alligators, and disease-carrying insects. The tidal system that made South Carolina rice cultivation so profitable also created perfect breeding conditions for malaria and yellow fever. The death rate among field hands was so high that planters calculated the life expectancy of a newly purchased enslaved person at just 7 years. Nearby, Asha worked with a crew of women responsible for weeding and pest control. Baby Zara remained strapped to her mother's back, her small head covered with a cloth to protect her from the sun. The infant's presence in the field violated no plantation rules. Enslaved children belonged to the master from birth, and their mothers were expected to maintain productivity regardless of childcare needs. "That baby needs water," observed Fatou, an elderly woman whose expertise in herbal medicine made her invaluable to the enslaved community. Fatou had been brought from what is now Senegal 40 years earlier and had accumulated knowledge that often meant the difference between life and death for her fellow workers. Asha paused in her weeding to offer Zara water from a gourd she carried. The baby drank eagerly, her small body already showing signs of heat exhaustion. During harvest season, when workdays stretched from dawn to dusk, infant mortality in the quarters reached devastating levels. Mothers faced impossible choices between caring for their children and meeting production quotas that, if missed, brought brutal punishment. The overseer's presence was constant and unpredictable. Morgan rode between the work crews on horseback, his whip always ready, watching for any sign of slacking or resistance. His authority was absolute within the fields, backed by colonial law that gave masters and their agents virtually unlimited power over enslaved bodies. "You there, Sambo!" Morgan shouted at Kwame, using the derogatory name he had assigned instead of learning actual names. "Put some muscle into it, or I'll give you something to remember me by." Kwame's jaw tightened at the insult, but he increased his pace without comment. Open resistance meant certain punishment and possible death. The enslaved had learned to channel their anger into subtler forms of defiance, working slowly when unobserved, accidentally breaking tools, or developing elaborate communication networks that allowed information to flow through the quarter faster than overseers could track. The rice cultivation process required precise timing that enslaved workers understood better than their white supervisors. Seeds had to be planted during specific tidal cycles. Water levels needed constant adjustment based on plant growth and weather conditions. Harvesting required knowledge of exactly when rice had reached optimal ripeness. This expertise gave enslaved workers a degree of power that they exercised carefully and strategically. "Water's getting too high in Section 3, Kunto observed to Quash during a brief rest period. "Needs to be drawn down, or we'll lose the whole crop." Quash nodded, but both men knew that suggesting changes to work procedures was dangerous. White overseers resented any implication that enslaved workers might know more about plantation operations than they did. The solution was often to allow mistakes to occur naturally, then step in with suggestions that appeared deferential while actually preventing disaster. As the day wore on, the heat became nearly unbearable. Several workers collapsed and had to be revived with water and rest in whatever shade could be found. The plantation provided no medical care beyond basic first aid, viewing sick or injured enslaved people as temporary interruptions to productivity rather than human beings deserving compassion. During the brief midday break, enslaved workers gathered in small groups to share food, water, and information. News traveled through these informal networks with remarkable speed. Word of escapes, punishments, sales, and deaths in neighboring plantations reached the quarter, often before it reached the master's house. "Heard tell there's talk of war coming," whispered Cuffy, as he shared cornbread with younger workers. White folks up north getting restless about something. This kind of information was precious in the quarter. Any disruption to the established order might create opportunities for escape or resistance. Enslaved people followed colonial politics with intense interest, understanding that their own fates were tied to larger conflicts between European powers and emerging colonial governments. The afternoon brought no relief from the heat or the relentless pace of work. As evening approached, workers began the complex process of adjusting water levels for the night. This required coordinating the timing of multiple floodgates across hundreds of acres, work that demanded both individual skill and collective cooperation. The return to the quarter at sunset was marked by exhaustion so complete that many workers could barely walk. Yet this was also when the enslaved community came most alive, freed from constant white supervision to maintain their own cultural practices and social connections. Cooking fires were lit in front of each cabin, supplementing the communal cookhouse where the day's main meal was prepared. Women who had worked in the fields all day now faced the additional burden of preparing food, mending clothes, and caring for children. Men gathered in small groups to repair tools, share news, and plan for the next day's challenges. The evening meal was a masterpiece of creativity, born from necessity. The weekly rations were supplemented by vegetables from garden plots, fish caught in nearby streams, and game trapped in the surrounding forests. African cooking techniques transformed these humble ingredients into meals that provided both physical sustenance and cultural continuity. The evening hours in the quarter revealed a world hidden from white eyes, where enslaved people created meaning and community despite the system designed to reduce them to mere labor units. As cooking fires flickered in front of each cabin, the air filled with the sounds of African languages, work songs, and laughter that served as both release and resistance. In the women's quarters, Asha sat with other mothers, sharing the burden of childcare while teaching their children the skills necessary for survival. The lessons began early and covered far more than white masters realized. Children learned to read facial expressions and body language that could signal danger. They mastered the art of appearing busy while actually resting. Most importantly, they absorbed the oral traditions that preserved African cultural heritage across generations. "Remember the story of Anansi," Fatu whispered to the children gathered around her, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. "He was small, but he was clever. He survived by using his mind instead of his strength." The Anansi stories, brought from West Africa, served multiple purposes in the quarter. They entertained children while teaching valuable lessons about surviving under oppression. The trickster figure who outwitted more powerful opponents provided a model for resistance that was both subtle and effective. These stories traveled from plantation to plantation, creating shared cultural references that bound the enslaved community together across vast distances. Meanwhile, in a cabin at the far end of the quarter, a different kind of education was taking place. Toby, an enslaved man who had learned to read by observing his master's children during their lessons, was secretly teaching literacy to a small group of trusted adults. Colonial law forbade educating enslaved people, making literacy a capital offense in many jurisdictions. "Each letter has its own sound," Toby explained softly, using a piece of charcoal to mark letters on a smooth board. "Put them together and they make words. Put words together and they tell stories." The risks were enormous. Discovery would mean severe punishment for both teacher and students, likely including sale to more brutal masters in distant locations. But literacy represented power that terrified slaveholders. The ability to forge passes, read newspapers, communicate over long distances, and access the ideas that fueled abolition movements in other parts of the world. Kunto participated in these lessons when his exhaustion from fieldwork permitted. At 35, learning to read required enormous effort, but he understood its strategic value. Literate enslaved people could gather information about legal changes, political developments, and opportunities for escape that remained invisible to those dependent solely on oral communication. The quarter also served as a center for medical knowledge that often surpassed what was available to white colonists. Fatu and other elderly women maintained extensive knowledge of herbal remedies, birthing practices and healing techniques brought from Africa and supplemented by knowledge of local plants learned through experimentation. In her cabin, Fatu tended to Scipio, a young man who had been injured when a rice-cutting tool slipped and gashed his leg. The plantation provided no medical care for such injuries, viewing them as the workers' responsibility to heal quickly and return to productivity. "This will hurt, child," Fatu warned as she cleaned the wound with water boiled with willow bark, "but it will heal clean if you keep it covered and don't work it too hard." She applied a poultice made from plants she had identified in the surrounding forest, knowledge that represented years of careful observation and experimentation. Enslaved healers had to work in secret, as colonial authorities viewed African medical practices with suspicion and often forbade their use. The spiritual life of the quarter blended Christian elements imposed by masters with African religious practices maintained in secret. Sunday services, conducted by white ministers or approved enslaved preachers, emphasized obedience and acceptance of earthly suffering in exchange for heavenly rewards. But in the privacy of their cabins, enslaved people maintained connections to ancestral spirits and African deities that provided comfort and strength. Late at night, when overseers were asleep and the quarter was theoretically quiet, small groups gathered for religious ceremonies that would have horrified their masters. These rituals honored ancestors, sought protection for dangerous work, and maintained spiritual connections to African homelands that slavery could not entirely sever. The quarter was also a center for economic activity that existed parallel to the plantation's official economy. Despite owning nothing legally, enslaved people created informal markets where they traded goods and services. Skilled craftsmen made tools, furniture, and household items during their limited free time. Women with knowledge of dyeing created colorful fabrics from plants gathered in the forest. Hunters and fishermen shared their catches in exchange for other goods or services. This underground economy served multiple purposes beyond simple survival. It allowed enslaved people to exercise agency and creativity in ways that the plantation system was designed to prevent. It created networks of mutual obligation and support that strengthened community bonds. Most importantly, it provided practice in economic decision-making that would prove valuable for those who eventually gained their freedom. Romance and family formation in the quarter required navigating the constant threat of separation. Couples could not legally marry, and any children belonged to the master rather than their parents. Yet people fell in love, formed committed relationships, and created families despite these constraints. Cudjoe, a skilled carpenter, had been courting Diana, one of the house servants, for nearly a year. Their relationship had to be conducted in stolen moments and secret glances, as house servants were subject to closer supervision and different rules than field hands. "Master's been talking about selling some of the field hands," Diana whispered to Cudjoe during a brief encounter behind the cookhouse. "Says rice prices are down and he needs to reduce costs." This kind of information was precious and terrifying. The threat of sale hung over every relationship in the quarter, creating anxiety that could only be managed, never eliminated. Couples lived with the knowledge that any day might bring permanent separation, making every moment together both precious and heartbreaking. As the night deepened and cooking fires burned low, the quarter settled into an uneasy quiet. Tomorrow would bring another day of brutal labor under the Carolina sun, but tonight provided a few hours of relative freedom to maintain the human connections that made survival possible. While you follow these intimate stories of survival and community, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more hidden histories of American slavery and the remarkable resilience of the human spirit under oppression. The sound that shattered the pre-dawn quiet was one that every enslaved person in the quarter had learned to fear. The heavy footsteps of multiple white men moving with purpose through the narrow paths between cabins. Gunto awakened instantly, his body tense with the hypervigilance that slavery had bred into every fiber of his being. Through the thin walls, he could hear low voices speaking in urgent whispers. "Get up, all of you!" Morgan's voice cut through the darkness like a blade. "Master wants everyone in the clearing now." The enslaved workers emerged from their cabins to find the quarter surrounded by armed white men, not just the usual overseers, but planters from neighboring estates and poor whites from the backcountry who served as the informal militia that policed the enslaved population. Their faces were grim in the torchlight, and their weapons were clearly visible. Master William Grimball stood in the center of the clearing, his usual facade of paternalistic authority replaced by cold fury. Beside him was a man Kunto didn't recognize, a tall, thin figure in a black coat who carried himself with the authority of someone accustomed to inflicting official punishment. "We have discovered," Grimball announced, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd, "that some among you have been engaged in illegal activities, learning to read, meeting in secret, plotting resistance." The words fell like stones into still water, sending ripples of fear through the gathered enslaved people. Children pressed closer to their parents. Adults avoided eye contact with their neighbors, knowing that any sign of recognition or shared guilt could prove fatal. Toby stood among the crowd, his face a mask of careful neutrality, but Kunto could see the terror in his eyes. Discovery of the literacy circle would mean not just punishment for those directly involved, but collective retribution against the entire quarter. "Mr. Whitmore here," Grimball continued, gesturing to the man in black, "is a magistrate from Charleston. He has been investigating reports of seditious activity among the Negro population throughout the Low Country. What he has discovered disturbs me greatly." Magistrate Whitmore stepped forward, pulling a piece of paper from his coat. Even in the flickering torchlight, Kunto could see it was covered with writing, evidence that someone in the quarter had been practicing the forbidden art of literacy. "This was found hidden in one of your cabins," Whitmore announced. "It contains not just evidence of illegal education, but plans for coordinated resistance across multiple plantations." And the accusation was partially true and partially fabrication, a common tactic used to justify harsh punishment while extracting confessions that might implicate others. The paper had indeed been found in Toby's cabin, but it contained only practice letters and simple words, not the elaborate conspiracy that Whitmore described. "I want to know who is responsible," Grimball continued, "and I want to know who else was involved. The guilty parties will be punished according to law. Those who cooperate will be treated with mercy." The offer of mercy was a trap, as everyone in the quarter understood. Cooperation meant betraying friends and family members. Silence meant collective punishment. Either choice led to pain, but the enslaved community had learned that solidarity often provided the best chance of survival. Minutes passed in heavy silence. No one stepped forward to confess or accuse others. The white men grew increasingly agitated, their torches casting dancing shadows that made their faces appear demonic in the darkness. "Very well," Whitmore said finally. "If no one will speak voluntarily, we will employ other methods of persuasion." What followed was a systematic campaign of terror designed to break the solidarity of the quarter and extract confessions through fear. The white men selected individuals at random for interrogation, using threats, physical violence, and psychological pressure to force betrayals. Cuffy, the elderly man who tended the gardens, was among the first chosen. Despite his age and obvious frailty, he was dragged to a post in the center of the clearing and tied with ropes. The interrogation that followed was brutal in its systematic cruelty. "We know you were involved, old man," Morgan snarled, brandishing his whip. "Tell us who the teacher was, and this will go easier for you." Cuffy's response was silence, his weathered face set with the dignity of someone who had survived decades of bondage without surrendering his essential humanity. The whip fell again and again, each stroke drawing gasps of pain from the old man and cries of anguish from the watching crowd. The torture continued for what felt like hours. Other enslaved people were selected for similar treatment. First the elderly, then younger adults, finally threatening to include children if confessions were not forthcoming. The strategy was designed to exploit the natural protective instincts of the community, making silence feel like betrayal of the most vulnerable members. Asha found herself pulled from the crowd, baby Zara still strapped to her back. The infant's presence was not accidental. The interrogators understood that threatening children was often the most effective way to break adult resistance. "This baby needs her mother," Whitmore said, his voice deceptively gentle as he drew a knife from his belt. But mothers who harbor criminals don't deserve to keep their children. Perhaps this little one would be better off sold to a family that values obedience. The threat of family separation was the ultimate weapon in the slaveholders' arsenal. More than physical pain, more than death itself, enslaved people feared the loss of their children to distant sails that made reunion impossible. Toby stepped forward before Asha could be forced to choose between confession and her child's safety. "I taught them to read," he said quietly, his voice carrying clearly across the silent quarter. "I found the book. I made the lessons. The others just wanted to learn." His confession brought immediate relief to Asha, but condemned him to certain death. Colonial law prescribed execution for enslaved people who taught literacy, viewing education as a direct threat to the stability of the slave system. But Toby's sacrifice also demonstrated the strength that sustained enslaved communities through their darkest moments. By taking full responsibility, he protected others who had participated in the lessons while maintaining the principle that knowledge was worth dying for. The punishment was swift and brutal. Toby was sentenced to hanging, his execution scheduled for the following morning as an example to other plantations in the region. But his courage had preserved the literacy circle's secrets and protected the children who represented the future of resistance. As dawn broke over the quarter, revealing the full extent of the night's devastation, the enslaved community began the slow process of healing and planning. They had lost Toby, but they had preserved their solidarity and their commitment to education as a tool of liberation. The events of that night would be remembered for generations, passed down through oral traditions as both warning and inspiration. They demonstrated the terrible cost of resistance, but also its necessity for maintaining human dignity under dehumanizing conditions. The weeks following Toby's execution brought changes to Magnolia Plantation that rippled through every aspect of daily life in the quarter. Master Grimball, shaken by the discovery of literacy among his enslaved workers, implemented new security measures designed to prevent future seditious activities. The quarter was now under constant surveillance, with armed guards positioned to observe all gatherings of more than 3 people. Yet, beneath the surface compliance that ensured survival, the enslaved community adapted with the resilience that had sustained them through generations of oppression. The literacy circle, rather than disappearing, evolved into something more sophisticated and secretive. Vatu, drawing on her knowledge of traditional African communication methods, developed a system of coded symbols that could be woven into basket patterns, carved into tool handles, or traced in the dirt and quickly erased. "The ancestors gave us many ways to speak," she explained to a small group gathered in her cabin under the pretense of treating a sick child. "White men can forbid our words, but they cannot silence our minds." Kunto, now one of the senior members of the enslaved community, found himself taking on responsibilities that Toby's death had left vacant. The informal leadership structure of the quarter operated through consensus and collective wisdom, with different individuals stepping forward based on their skills and the community's needs. The rice harvest of 1704 brought both triumph and sorrow to the quarter. The crop was the most successful in Magnolia Plantation's history, a testament to the agricultural expertise of the enslaved workers who had perfected techniques their masters barely understood. Yet the profits from their labor would be used to purchase more enslaved people, expanding the system that held them in bondage. During the harvest, news reached the quarter through the informal networks that connected plantations across the Low Country. A ship carrying newly enslaved Africans had arrived in Charleston, its human cargo destined for plantations throughout South Carolina. Among those purchased for Magnolia Plantation was a young woman named Aminata, recently captured from what is now Sierra Leone. Aminata's arrival brought both joy and grief to the quarter. The community welcomed her with the same solidarity they showed all newcomers, sharing food, clothing, and the survival knowledge necessary for adapting to bondage. But her presence also served as a painful reminder of the ongoing violence that fed the slave system. "She speaks no English," Asher observed as she helped Aminata settle into the women's quarters. "But her eyes show she understands everything." The process of integrating new arrivals was both practical and spiritual. Experienced enslaved people taught newcomers the routines of plantation life, the personalities and dangers of white overseers, and the unspoken rules that governed survival. But they also worked to preserve the newcomers' connections to their African heritage while helping them adapt to American bondage. Aminata possessed knowledge of rice cultivation from her homeland that surpassed even the expertise of long-established workers. Her arrival coincided with Master Grimball's desire to expand rice production into new areas of the plantation, creating opportunities for the enslaved community to leverage their collective knowledge for small improvements in their living conditions. "The new fields need different water management," Kunto explained to Quash during a planning session disguised as routine work discussion. "The African woman knows techniques that could increase yields significantly, but we should ask for concessions in exchange for our cooperation." This kind of strategic thinking represented the sophisticated resistance that enslaved people had developed over generations. Rather than simply complying with masters' demands, they learned to bargain collectively, using their indispensable skills to negotiate marginal improvements in food rations, work schedules, or living conditions. The negotiations were conducted through intermediaries and coded conversations that maintained the appearance of willing cooperation while actually representing calculated economic pressure. Master Grimball focused on profit margins and competitive advantage over neighboring planters, gradually agreed to modest concessions that improved daily life in the quarter. The most significant victory was the establishment of Saturday afternoons as free time for the enslaved community, hours that could be used for tending personal gardens, conducting trade with neighboring plantations, or simply resting. This time became precious beyond measure, allowing for cultural activities, family relationships, and community building that strengthened resistance networks. During one of these Saturday gatherings, Cuffy, now recovered from his injuries but bearing permanent scars from the night of interrogation, shared news that would reshape the quarter's understanding of their situation. "Word from Charleston," he said quietly to a trusted group gathered around his garden plot. "There's talk of war coming. The white folks up north are getting restless about taxes and such. Some say there might be opportunities for us if the fighting spreads south." The American Revolution was still decades away, but colonial unrest was already creating cracks in the system of control that enslaved people watched with intense interest. Any disruption to established authority might create opportunities for escape, resistance, or even liberation. Aminata, whose English had improved rapidly through intensive informal instruction, contributed her own observations. "In my village, we had stories of kingdoms across the Great Water where no people were enslaved. Perhaps these stories were about the northern colonies. The idea that freedom might be possible somewhere in America was both inspiring and dangerous. It fueled dreams of escape, while creating risks for those who might attempt the nearly impossible journey to free territories. As autumn turned to winter, the quarter settled into seasonal rhythms that had remained constant despite the upheavals of the previous year. The rice harvest was complete, and attention turned to food preservation, clothing repair, and the maintenance tasks that would sustain the community through the coming months. But beneath these familiar patterns, fundamental changes were taking place. The literacy circle had evolved into a broader network of cultural preservation and resistance planning. The arrival of Aminata had strengthened connections to African heritage, while expanding agricultural knowledge. Most importantly, the community had demonstrated its ability to survive brutal repression while maintaining solidarity and hope. Kunto, now approaching 40 and recognized as one of the quarter's informal leaders, reflected on these changes as he watched children play in the evening light. These young ones would face different challenges than his generation, but they would also inherit the accumulated wisdom and strength of a community that had refused to be broken. "We are still here," he told Fatu, as they observed the evening rituals of cooking, storytelling, and quiet celebration that marked another day survived. "They have taken much from us, but they cannot take everything. Our children will know who they are and where they came from." The enslaved community of Magnolia Plantation had learned that freedom was not something that could be given or taken away entirely. It was something that existed in the spaces between oppression, in the relationships that sustained human dignity, and in the knowledge that resistance took many forms. As the stars appeared over the South Carolina lowcountry, illuminating the same sky that stretched over free communities in distant places, the quarter settled into another night of dreams, deferred but not abandoned. Tomorrow would bring another day of forced labor under the Carolina sun, but it would also bring another opportunity to preserve culture, protect family, and prepare for whatever changes the future might hold. Their story reminds us that the human spirit cannot be enslaved entirely, no matter how brutal the system designed to contain it. In the slave quarters of colonial America, people maintained their humanity through acts of love, creativity, and resistance that echo through history as testimonies to the power of community and hope. While these stories of survival and resilience continue to inspire us centuries later, remember to subscribe to our channel and share these important histories that help us understand the foundations of American society and the ongoing struggle for justice and human dignity.